Imagine standing in the center of a cavernous hall, stretching nearly the length of 3 football fields, but the air is perfectly still. There is no hum of conversation, no clatter of footsteps on terrazzo tile, no music drifting from the speakers. The only sound is the distant rhythmic dripping of water from a leak in the skylight, echoing through a structure that was once the beating heart of American culture. Weeds are pushing through the cracks in the pavement where millions of sneakers once trod, and the pale, ghostly mannequins in the darkened windows stand as silent sentinels to a forgotten empire. This is the American shopping mall in its death throes, a colossal monument to consumerism that rose with breathtaking speed and died with a slow, agonizing whimper. But to understand why these cathedrals of commerce are rotting away in the suburbs of America, we have to go back to the beginning, to a time when the very idea of them was considered a futuristic utopia. The story begins not with a corporation, but with an architect who hated cars and a vision to save the American city from itself. In the middle of the 20th century, America was changing forever. Soldiers were coming home from the war, the economy was booming, and the baby boom was in full swing. Millions of families were fleeing the crowded, dirty cities for the promise of the suburbs, tracts of manicured lawns and picket fences that seemed to offer a piece of the American dream. But there was a problem. The suburbs were residential, they were bedrooms. If you wanted to buy a coat, see a movie, or just get a cup of coffee, you had to get back in your car and drive all the way back to the downtown city center. And those city centers were decaying. They were smog-filled, traffic-clogged, and increasingly seen as dangerous. Enter Victor Gruen. He was a Jewish socialist architect who had fled Nazi Vienna and landed in America. He looked at the sprawling suburbs and saw a spiritual vacuum, a place where people were isolated in their homes, disconnected from the community. Gruen had a radical idea. He wanted to take the European concept of the town square, the piazza, and bring it indoors, protecting it from the weather and the noise. He wanted to create a space that wasn't just about buying things, but about civilizing the suburbs. In 1954, he unveiled his masterpiece, Southdale Center in Edina, Minnesota. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It was fully enclosed, climate-controlled to a perfect 72 degrees, and featured a massive garden courtyard with birds and trees, all under a glass roof. For the suburban housewife trapped in a split-level home, it wasn't just a store, it was an escape. It was a destination. And the people came. They came in their millions. The developers saw what Gruen had built, and they realized they had struck gold, but they stripped away his socialist ideals and kept the money-making parts. Gruen had envisioned shops on the periphery and a community center in the middle, schools, post offices, and libraries. Instead, the developers filled every square inch with retail. The anchor store concept was born. Massive department stores like Sears, JCPenney, and Montgomery Ward were placed at the far ends of the mall to draw people through the gauntlet of smaller specialty shops in between. It was a perfect predatory design. You went to buy a shirt at Sears, but you had to walk past the record store, the pretzel stand, and the fountain to get there. The logic was simple. Put everything within reach, and the consumer will consume. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the mall exploded across the American landscape. It became the de facto town square for a generation that had no other town square. It was where you went to be seen. It was where the teenagers hung out, where seniors took their morning walks, and where families spent their Saturdays. By the 1980s, the mall had reached its peak cultural dominance. It was the era of excess, of neon lights, of multi-story fountains, and the golden age of the food court. The mall was no longer just a place to shop. It was a cultural ecosystem. It was the setting for movies like Fast Times at Ridgemont High and Clueless. It was the birthplace of the modern teenager as a distinct consumer demographic. But beneath the polished glass and the muzak, the cracks were already beginning to form. You see, the shopping mall relied on a very specific set of economic and social conditions to survive, and those conditions were starting to shift. First, there was the issue of saturation. In the greed of the 80s and 90s, developers built too many malls. They were cannibalizing each other. If a town had one successful mall, a developer would build a bigger, shinier one 5 miles away, splitting the customer base in half and dooming both to mediocrity. Then came the social shifts. The malls that had once been safe havens for the middle class began to feel different. As wealth inequality widened, the demographics of the suburbs shifted. The white flight that had built the malls began to move further outward to lifestyle centers, open-air shopping villages that felt safer and more exclusive. The older enclosed malls began to be seen as gritty, dangerous, or simply for the poor class. The teenagers that the malls had cultivated as their future customers were now seen as loiterers. Malls implemented strict curfews and codes of conduct, banning groups of kids from walking together. They killed the very culture that made them cool. But the true killer was lurking in the background, invisible at first, but inevitable. A technology that would render the physical gathering place obsolete. We all know what happened next. The internet. But it wasn't just Amazon, it was the digitization of everything. The mall killed the downtown, but the internet killed the mall. Why drive 20 minutes, park, walk, and deal with a sales clerk when you could order the same item from your couch at 3 a.m.? The convenience was undeniable, but the fatal blow was the collapse of the financial structure. Remember the anchor stores? Sears, JCPenney, Macy's. They were the pillars that held the roof up. The leases for these smaller stores, the Gap, the Foot Locker, the Sunglass Hut, were all contingent on the big anchors staying open. If an anchor left, the specialty stores had clauses in their contracts that allowed them to stop paying rent. And when the anchors started to fall, the domino effect was catastrophic. But why did the anchors fall? Because they were bloated, carrying massive amounts of debt, and they refused to adapt to the digital age. Sears, once the Amazon of its day, selling everything from houses to clothes, was run into the ground by mismanagement and hedge fund asset. Stripping. When Sears declared bankruptcy, it wasn't just a store closing. It was a seismic event that shook the foundations of nearly every mall in America. The year 2008 was the turning point. The Great Recession changed American spending habits forever. The home equity line of credit that people used to buy clothes and gadgets evaporated. The middle class was squeezed. People started to question value. They began to prioritize experiences over things. And just as the economy was collapsing, a new trend was emerging: the dead mall. Photographers and urban explorers began documenting these ruins. Videos of abandoned fountains rotting with green slime, escalators leading to nowhere, and storefronts covered in graffiti went viral. It became a morbid fascination. We were staring at our own recent history, a timeline of plastic prosperity decaying in real time. The silence of these places is heavy. It's the sound of an era ending. Today, the statistics are grim. There are roughly 1,000 enclosed malls left in the United States, and analysts predict that within a decade, only about 250 of them will still be open. The rest are destined for the wrecking ball or something stranger. But here is where the story takes a twist, because the building itself isn't always dying. It is evolving. In the strangest suspense twist of this narrative, the mall is not just dying, it is being repurposed into things you would never expect. The corpses of these giants are becoming the new infrastructure of America. In Austin, Texas, a dead mall became a medical school. In Cleveland, an old Sears store is now a data center housing the servers of the very internet that killed the retail store. In some places, malls are being turned into community colleges, libraries, and even call centers. In one bizarre case, a mall in Ohio was transformed into a Chinese-invested American Dream Center. The architecture is so versatile because the boxes are so big. And then there are the zombie malls. These are the ones that aren't dead but aren't alive. They have 30% occupancy. The lights are dimmed to save money. The fountains are dry. You can buy a pretzel, but you can't buy a pair of jeans. The walking clubs of seniors continue their morning laps, oblivious to the decay surrounding them, circling like ghosts in a machine that has stopped working. As we look at the ruins of these titans today, it is easy to feel a sense of loss. A
nostalgia for a time when life seemed simpler, slower, and more tangible. But perhaps the death of the mall is a mirror reflecting the death of the America that created it.
It was an America built on infinite resources, cheap oil, and the assumption that we could just keep expanding outward forever. We built these temples to stuff, worshipping at the altar of consumption, only to find that the stuff didn't make us happy, and the resources ran out. The silence of the dead mall is the sound of us waking up from that dream. We are moving back to cities, to walkable streets, to main streets that look like the ones the malls destroyed. We are circling back, trying to find the community that Gruen originally tried to build, but without the shopping bags.